So it's great to be with you all today because I get to cover one of my favorite topics, which is what is the role of religious NGOs specifically at the United Nations. Teresa spoke a bit about how civil society at large fits into the very complex UN structure, but I want to speak a bit more to the content of the role of faith-based and specifically Catholic religious NGOs in this very complex space. And so as an important precursor to understanding the role, I always like to give a sense of the scope of the size of who we are as religious NGOs. So there are a little over 30 NGOs that are representing congregations of Catholic women and men religious that have accreditation either with the Economic and Social Council or with the Department of Global Communications. And collectively, these 30 NGOs are representing over 200 congregations because many of the NGOs are themselves coalitions representing multiple congregations. Or a charismatic family of congregations. And collectively, this group has been present in the civil society space at the United Nations for over 20 years now, probably really closer to 30 at this point now that we're in 2020. And there's some very particular quality that religious NGOs are able to infuse into conversations and negotiations in UN spaces. And this is definitely a broad overview, but I like to kind of pull out 4 key phrases to describe that particular quality of voice. First is credibility. The religious NGOs bring credibility because they have been ministering to the poorest and the most marginalized and the most vulnerable populations all over the world in some of the most remote areas on the ground, most of them for centuries. We like to say they've been doing the work of the SDGs since long before the SDGs were put into words at the United Nations. And so that kind of history certainly brings with it a powerful credibility into the conversation. There's also an important quality of impartiality because religious NGOs are typically present in a very large number of countries, or at the very least more than 1 or 2. And that allows for kind of a lack of particular national identity that creates bias towards, say, one government or an affiliation with one government or another. They're really borderless entities. And then, of course, as you might imagine, religious NGOs are known for bringing a moral voice as faith-based groups because their entire structure and vision is built around a value system that dedicates all of their works and all of their advocacy to human dignity of all peoples and care for the natural environment as well. And finally, the quality of the religious voice at the UN brings a stability and cohesion to the conversation. If you've spent more than even a year at the UN, you'll see that sometimes there's kind of a swinging pendulum. Even within one government from year to year, political powers and alliances shift over time. And so a government that supports one issue this year might be considered an obstacle from our perspective on that same issue next year, and vice versa. And that, of course, is due to the changing nature of political winds. However, because religious NGOs are so deeply rooted in a very old and carefully refined value system, you don't see that same kind of shifting of winds or shifting of positions from year to year or really decade to decade. And in this case, now that we're at 75 years of the UN, we're seeing not even a shift from generation to generation. And that is a very important quality to bring to UN conversations because the multilateral process is so dependent on good faith debate, good faith negotiation, and authentic presentation of one's values that it's very helpful to the overall process to kind of have a stable and steady voice that is ever committed to the foundations of the UN itself, which are largely outlined in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And so when I talk about how religious NGOs are doing their work at the UN, I typically kind of use three catchphrases to describe their three approaches, which I refer to in shorthand as getting in the way, getting out of the way, and modeling a new way. And by getting in the way, what I mean is occupying space in places of power on behalf of those who cannot be present in those spaces in order to infuse the conversation with the perspectives, experiences, and needs of those groups of people that would otherwise be absent from the conversation. So as I'm sure you've already gathered in your short stints even with your organizations, that's one of the primary ways we do that as religious NGOs is by creating interventions, either in writing or spoken interventions on the floor of the UN to offer our position and our voices. We also participate, of course, in our own country's political systems, exercising rights to vote or lobby as they are available to us. And we also are, at times when large gatherings are possible, we're also groups that participate in physical protests and demonstrations. Basically, think of any action that seeks to kind of interrupt an injustice that's already in progress. That kind of fits under the umbrella of getting in the way. Then the second catchphrase, getting out of the way, is about kind of recognizing where we're able to take that space, that privileged space that we have, and vacate it to allow for those absent voices to come into the space and speak for themselves, which is kind of a higher order of advocacy, if you will, because what's even better than us speaking for a marginalized population is for a marginalized population to speak for themselves. And so that's something that we seek to do in a few different ways in our UN work. One of the primary ways is by organizing events or other opportunities for marginalized individuals to speak at the United Nations. Whenever we're writing statements or seeking to put together a position paper, we typically collect testimony of marginalized individuals and include their stories and experiences in our statements and reports. And we also attempt to kind of share the exact content of statements that are put forth by marginalized groups themselves, which an easy way to do that is through our various social media channels, you know, the sharing, the reposting, the retweeting, kind of taking the exact content that's coming straight from the voice of the person with the experience and just kind of sharing it with a broader network so that that voice can be broadcast over a wider area and reach more ears. And finally, and this is probably the most complex of the three catchphrases in the approach to advocacy, is modeling a new way. And that essentially could be boiled down to walking the talk. So that means not only presenting lots of lovely and challenging ideas to our political leaders and our diplomatic leaders, but also demonstrating how those ideas can actually be implemented, how they can be lived out and integrated into life and systems in a practical way. Because one obstacle that we often come up against in conversation with political or diplomatic leaders is the sense that what we're asking for is unrealistic. And so this is a very important component of our advocacy, because we are in fact demonstrating it's not unrealistic at all. In fact, watch, we're doing it. And so, as you can imagine, this is a very complex undertaking. It includes basically every facet of life and work, including what we choose to buy, wear, and eat, and the sources of each of those things, how we travel and how often, especially considering environmental impact of travel, particularly air travel, where we save or invest our money, in whose hands is it, what types of projects is that invested money funding. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, our modeling of a new way entails demonstrating a way of working well with others. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail because it is a huge piece of the way we operate as religious NGOs, which is by collaborating with one another and demonstrating for the member states of the UN how we would like to see them collaborate and come to the table authentically and in good faith to work together, to cooperate, and to create change. So one of the ways that you've heard mention of already that the religious NGOs come together, particularly the Catholic Religious NGOs, is through an informal group known as RUN, or Religious at the UN. And this is fully informal, open-ended group that's open to all UN representatives of Catholic congregations of women and men religious. It meets on the first Wednesday of every month. And normally it's an in-person meeting somewhere in Midtown East, but of course, currently that meeting is happening via Zoom. And essentially the content and I hesitate to even call it structure, but it does have a loose structure to it, is to provide spiritual fellowship, mentorship among those of us here in the UN ministry, co-learning opportunities, orientation like this one for newly arriving representatives, and kind of a home base for idea sharing and networking within the UN NGO community. It's definitely fertile soil for collaboration and sharing information, because new details are always coming at us from all sides, and the process always changes from year to year. So even when you think maybe you're an old veteran expert, something will change the next year and you'll need new eyes and ears to keep you apprised of what has changed. So it's a good space for that. And I won't go into all of these, but just to say there are many committees of NGOs working in civil society broadly at the UN, and the religious representatives, the RUN members, are frequently serving in leadership roles and participating very constructively in these committees. And so this is just a smattering of committees where you'll tend to see a lot of religious NGOs represented, but Dusty will discuss that more, so I won't go into them. And then there are a few other coalitions where we see the presence of religious NGOs, one of which is the Coalition for Global Citizenship 2030. Another is the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors. And finally, the Justice Coalition of Religious, which is the entity that I personally work for and attempt to facilitate and coordinate collaboration among the 19 member NGOs in order to build capacity for advocacy, both at the United Nations and among religious communities at the grassroots. And I'll go through this last bit rather quickly, but I'll remind you, of course, these slides will be available afterwards, so don't worry too much if it feels like a lot to take in quickly. So some of the benefits of our way of working together, in addition to modeling a new way for the member states of the UN, is that it's a creative way of responding to what we're experiencing as a shrinking space for civil society at the UN. We find year after year, there are shorter time allowances for us to speak, tighter word count limits for our written statements. We're asked more and more by the member states to submit joint statements versus individual statements. When we can kind of crowdsource our information and testimony gathered from our members on the ground, that means we're able to present more comprehensive and impactful data sets or examples in our statements. And we're also able to creatively share grounds passes when we are allowed to use grounds passes again, in order to maximize the physical presence that we are able to take in UN meeting rooms. We also have a variety of ways that we share costs and workloads having to do with sharing workspaces, meeting spaces, event planning duties, communication materials and articles, and even sharing accommodations when we travel to conferences that are outside the New York City area. There's also many opportunities for co-teaching and co-learning among us, because there are so many experts here, but each one coming from a different background in a slightly different area, and that serves very well for each of us to help address our various gaps or blind spots in our own knowledge, and also extend our, what I call cross-organization community memory or institutional memory that extends not only from, say, our predecessor to our successor as a UN representative, but also goes across organizations, like through opportunities such as this one, where we're learning from the histories of many organizations who have had this as a ministry. And then finally, a benefit of collaboration is providing individual freedom that maximizes our collective impact. Because by building relationships with one another, we are assured that if we choose to contribute deeply in one particular issue area or two, we know that we are in fact contributing to all issue areas. Which frees us up from a feeling that we must do it all and becoming too overextended to really have any meaningful impact in any particular area. And it also allows us to be strategic in selecting new areas or rising issues in which we want to build personal expertise and contribute to the community as a whole. And it also allows us to stay generally informed on a very broad array of issues, even as we personally seek to specialize or dig deeper in one particular issue area. And I'll close this section, though it does segue right into the next one with this proverb that I like very much when I talk about collaboration, because it provides a lovely image, is when spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion. And I think in a phrase that very much describes the thinking behind our process of collaboration as religious NGOs at the UN. And I will pause there in case anyone has any immediate questions before we move on to the next section, which will deal further with some of the groups that I just mentioned and the specific details of how that collaboration actually takes place logistically.
Teresa.
Yes, Jim.
This thing about shrinking space for NGOs at the UN. Now, I gather part of it would be obvious, I think, that as so many countries become more authoritarian and more with an extreme nationalistic approach to things, starting with our own country, of course, it's easier, I guess, for those representatives, those member states, sort of to ignore the NGOs in a time of pandemic when you're not physically running into them in corridors, etc. It's much more difficult. It's easy for them to just simply ignore us. Is that the main reason for the shrinking space at the UN for us? Maybe better.
On a broad sense, I would say that's probably the main phenomenon behind it, because that does. It's certainly like this, the trend toward authoritarianism certainly extends beyond individual countries. However, in some sense, it's also kind of like the same that we see. In some sense, the internet is a broad, wide open space that's accessible to everyone, but so broad and so open, there's so much noise that really it's hard for anyone to get attention. Because everyone is speaking. And in some sense, the UN as an entity, the whole system is now covering such a broad array of issues. And there are so many different NGOs that there are many voices that are kind of clamoring to be heard. And so it's very important for us to take the approach of, while of course we do want to advocate that the space that we have as civil society as a whole is preserved, it's so important that we not see each other as competitors, and that we always speak from a place of common purpose and are able to focus on our shared values and recognize that I don't always need to be the one to speak to have my point be heard, because many other people have the same underlying message and we'll just deliver it from a different vantage point with a different example. And so some of it's just about creativity and really learning to understand in a deep way what it is to collaborate, what it is to believe in the common good, and make our work less about me getting credit for having made a statement and more about just making sure that the truth is out on the table.
Thank you.
And yeah, you're welcome. Anything else before we move on?
Teresa?
Yes, Thomas.
This is a very beautiful presentation. There was two elements. One is that maybe we need to revisit the whole idea of impartiality that was there in one of the earliest slides. We are not impartial. I know I'm seeing it from the perspective of what you explained, that we are across nations, and therefore between nation states and nation states, there's a sense of partiality. But when it comes to issues, what you explained so well later on the slides, that we are with the marginalized, and therefore we will not be impartial. We will not be impartial. So somewhere we need to, forefront that whole idea, which you've done very beautifully in the later, sessions. That's one thing. And the second,
Sure.
And the second thing is about the opportunity that we have here as representatives of our own congregations, connecting them back in our countries with our large networks, which we get familiar here. And that's the only way we can take the policies at the UN, which we are familiar with and we advocate for, get legitimized in countries, because all said and done, finally, anything to happen, it has to happen in the countries that we work. And therefore the opportunity that provides us, or connecting across networks, not only here, but back in the countries of origin where our references are. And the third, responding to the shrinking space of civil society. From MDGs to SDGs, the main shift has been that it has now a human rights framework. And the more NGOs stress the human rights framework, and that's where the shrinking spaces, that happens. As long as we are going to be a service delivery organization, I think no government will have ever any problem with us. And they would want our collaboration to augment the funds that they don't have, if we are bent on service delivery. Of course, there are in India, like for instance, religious conversion, they would say the Christian organizations are putting in money. So that's another aspect. But on the whole, any service delivery organization is most welcome in the government circles. So I think the shrinking space to some extent is a credit that we should take for ourselves, that we are more and more focusing on a development which is right-based, and that's what we also experience from in what we have framework in SDGs, particularly 10 and 16. And the more we push for that, and we will find that, this happens. So let's not be sorry about that. I think it's time to push back.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a key insight. I just want to note, I put up a little post on Twitter about what's going on this morning in our orientation. Just would urge you, if you happen to have social media channels that you're working on, feel free to post about this event. We'll have a separate training at some point about best uses of social media and how that's becoming an important tool, especially in these COVID times. But I know that Teresa and Beatrice and Dusty have more wonderful stuff to share with us. So let's go ahead and move on.